In the final 30 seconds before the French sword severed her neck, Anne Boleyn's eyes darted beneath her blindfold, searching for a sound that would never come. The executioner had been paid extra to approach in silence. What you're about to discover about her death will shatter everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and the lengths the elite will go to erase those who threaten their control. This isn't just history. This is a blueprint for psychological destruction that powerful men still use today. The official story says Anne Boleyn was executed for adultery and treason. That's a lie. What really happened was the systematic dismantling of a woman who had grown too powerful, too influential, and too dangerous for Henry VIII to control. Her execution wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare perfected. For 17 days, she was held in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had prepared for her coronation just 3 years earlier. But this time, she wasn't preparing to become queen. She was being slowly broken down, piece by piece, in a campaign of mental torture so sophisticated it would make modern intelligence agencies take notes. Henry didn't just want Anne dead. He wanted her destroyed. He wanted her legacy obliterated, her daughter delegitimized, and her very existence erased from the memory of England. The execution you've heard about, a quick, merciful beheading by a skilled French swordsman, was just the final act in a months-long psychological assassination that targeted not just her body, but her mind, her reputation, and her soul. They didn't teach you this in school because the truth reveals how power really operates when it feels threatened. Every detail of her final days was calculated. The delayed execution dates, designed to maximize psychological torment. The imported executioner, chosen for theatrical effect. The low scaffold, built to deny her dignity. The carnival atmosphere, orchestrated to turn her death into entertainment. This wasn't medieval brutality. This was modern psychological warfare deployed with surgical precision against a woman who dared to challenge the most powerful man in Europe. The night before her execution, Anne Boleyn requested the sacrament at 2 a.m. and knelt before it for hours. She hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours. Her mind was fracturing under the weight of sleep deprivation, isolation, and the psychological manipulation techniques that Thomas Cromwell, Henry's master strategist, had perfected in the dungeons of power. What they did to her in those final weeks wasn't just imprisonment. It was a masterclass in breaking the human spirit, using methods that intelligence agencies would later codify as enhanced interrogation. You need to understand something. Anne Boleyn wasn't some helpless victim. She was one of the most politically astute women of her era, fluent in multiple languages, educated in the courts of Europe, and capable of matching wits with kings and emperors. To destroy someone of that caliber required more than just accusations. It required a systematic dismantling of everything she was, everything she represented, and everything she might become. They had to break her mind before they could justify taking her life. The charges against her, adultery with 5 men including her own brother, were so absurd they wouldn't survive 5 minutes in any legitimate court. But that wasn't the point. The accusations weren't meant to be believable. They were meant to be devastating. Each charge was carefully crafted to destroy a different aspect of her identity. The adultery charges attacked her virtue. The incest allegations destroyed her family bonds. The treason accusation eliminated her political legitimacy. This wasn't legal prosecution, it was character assassination weaponized into judicial murder. During those 17 days in the Tower, Anne was subjected to techniques that modern psychologists recognize as systematic torture. Sleep deprivation, social isolation, constant interrogation, false information about her daughter's fate, staged evidence of her husband's rage. Every psychological pressure point was identified and exploited. By the time she walked to that scaffold, the woman who had once captivated a king and changed the course of English history had been methodically reduced to a broken shell, desperately clinging to whatever dignity remained. On the morning of her execution, witnesses described Anne as laughing with her companions. Historians call this composure. Psychologists call it dissociation, a defense mechanism triggered by trauma so severe the mind simply fractures to protect itself. She wasn't brave. She was broken. And that breakdown was exactly what Henry VIII had orchestrated from the beginning. The laughter wasn't courage, it was the sound of a mind that could no longer process the reality of its situation. What happened to Anne Boleyn reveals the playbook that powerful men use when a woman becomes too influential, too independent, or too threatening to their control. First, they isolate her from her support network. Then they flood the information space with accusations designed to destroy her credibility. They use the legal system as a weapon, creating the appearance of justice while ensuring the outcome is predetermined. Finally, they make her destruction into a public spectacle, a warning to any other woman who might dare to challenge their authority. The timing of her execution was deliberately manipulated to maximize psychological torture. The date was changed multiple times, a technique still used in modern psychological operations to destroy a subject's ability to mentally prepare for trauma. Each postponement reset her fear response, flooding her system with stress hormones, breaking down her psychological defenses. By the time they finally came for her, she had experienced the anticipation of death so many times that her mind had essentially shut down to protect itself from the unbearable anxiety. Henry's decision to import a French executioner wasn't mercy, it was theater. The swordsman cost 30 times more than a local headsman, but the investment was worth it for the propaganda value. A foreign executioner made the execution feel more exotic, more significant. It separated Anne's death from common English justice and elevated it to the level of international spectacle. Every element was designed not just to kill her, but to send a message about what happens when you threaten the established order of power. The most chilling aspect of Anne's psychological destruction was how thoroughly it worked. Within hours of her execution, court painters were destroying her portraits. Stone masons were chiseling her symbols from palace walls. Courtiers learned that mentioning her name could invite royal disfavor. It was as if she had never existed at all, exactly as Henry had planned. This wasn't just execution. It was systematic erasure of a human being from history itself. The scaffold built for Anne's execution stood only 3 feet off the ground, deliberately low to deny her the dignity of elevation and bring her closer to the jeering crowd. This wasn't an oversight. Every detail of Tudor executions was calculated for maximum psychological impact. The low platform forced the condemned to look up at their tormentors rather than down at them. It transformed what should have been a solemn moment of justice into a degrading spectacle where the audience could see every expression, every tear, every moment of human vulnerability. Tower Green that morning wasn't the respectful, somber gathering you've seen in movies. Historical records describe a carnival-like atmosphere, intentionally fostered to turn Anne's death into entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink to spectators. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views. People placed bets on whether she would faint or maintain composure. The execution of a Queen of England had been transformed into public theater, and she was both the star and the sacrifice. The crowd wasn't random civilians who happened to be present. Many were court supporters strategically placed to ensure the right reaction. They had been primed with months of propaganda about Anne's alleged crimes, fed a steady diet of rumors about her sexual immorality and treasonous plots. When she appeared on the scaffold, they were ready with their jeers and taunts, their voices forming a wall of condemnation that served to justify what was about to happen. The crowd's hatred wasn't organic. It was manufactured, weaponized, and deployed as psychological torture. What makes this even more sinister is that Henry VIII didn't attend his wife's execution. While she died, he remained at Whitehall Palace, already planning his wedding to Jane Seymour. The man who had once written love letters calling Anne his darling and sweetheart couldn't be bothered to witness the death he had orchestrated. This absence wasn't cowardice. It was calculated cruelty, a final demonstration of how completely she had been cast aside. Her execution was so beneath his notice that he treated it like a minor administrative task to be completed while he focused on more important matters. The guards who escorted Anne to the scaffold weren't there out of respect or ceremony. They were there to prevent escape and ensure compliance. These same corridors she had once walked as queen, accepting the bows and curtsies of courtiers, now witnessed her final journey under armed guard. The psychological impact of this reversal, from sovereign to prisoner along the same path, was another deliberate cruelty designed to emphasize her complete fall from grace. Anne's final speech wasn't the noble defiance portrayed in popular culture. It was the carefully constrained words of a woman who knew that even her last utterances would be scrutinized for any hint of rebellion. "Good people, I have come here to die, for according to the law I am condemned to die, and so I will say nothing against it." These weren't the words of acceptance. They were the words of someone who understood that any criticism of the king could doom her 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth to the same fate. Every word of that speech had to navigate a minefield of political consequences. She couldn't proclaim her innocence without implying the king's justice was flawed. She couldn't express anger without being labeled unrepentant. She couldn't show fear without being called a coward. The speech that history remembers as dignified was actually the final demonstration of how completely the system had constrained her even in death. She had been reduced to a puppet, forced to validate her own destruction to protect the child she was leaving behind. The French executioner she faced in her final moments was a stranger, another calculated insult. She would die at the hands of someone who didn't know her, couldn't be influenced by personal connection, and felt no obligation to show mercy beyond technical competence. This foreign killer had been practicing his technique on animals to perfect the single clean stroke that would ensure the spectacle proceeded without the embarrassing complications of a botched execution. But here's what they never tell you about that merciful beheading. The blindfold wasn't kindness. Preventing the condemned from seeing the approaching blade serves a practical function. It eliminates last-minute movements that could disrupt the execution. Anne knelt upright in the French style rather than laying her head on a block, a position that required absolute stillness through pure willpower. As she moved her lips in prayer, her ears strained to hear the approaching blade, experiencing the psychological torture of not knowing when death would strike. The sword itself was a symbol of the theatrical nature of her destruction. Henry had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage the perfect spectacle for a queen's fall. The blade was specially balanced for a horizontal strike rather than the downward blow of an English axe. Even her method of death had been chosen for maximum dramatic effect and minimum mess, ensuring the show would proceed without the unpleasant complications that might diminish its propaganda value. If you're starting to understand the true scope of what happened to Anne Boleyn, how power systematically destroys those who threaten it, then you're ready to go deeper. Comment "Awaken the Sleeper" below if you recognize these patterns in today's world. Comment it twice if you're ready to see how these same techniques are being used right now, in plain sight, against anyone who dares challenge the modern power structure. The algorithm needs to know you're ready for the forbidden knowledge that comes next. The beheading itself was remarkably clean by Tudor standards, a single stroke that severed Anne's head completely. But what happened in the seconds that followed reveals the horrifying reality of death that sanitized histories always omit. Witnesses reported that her eyes continued to blink, her lips tried to form words, and awareness lingered for nearly 30 seconds as life ebbed away. This wasn't peaceful passing. It was conscious experience of decapitation, the mind trapped in a severed head as it slowly died. Several spectators fainted at this gruesome display of the fragile boundary between life and death. Others turned away in disgust, suddenly confronted with the reality that they were witnessing not justice but slaughter. The clean execution they had been promised evolved into a macabre demonstration of human biology that left even hardened courtiers shaken. Anne's death wasn't just brutal, it was educationally brutal, designed to teach everyone present exactly what happened to those who crossed the king. No proper coffin had been arranged for Anne's remains. Her devastated ladies in waiting had to scramble to find an old arrow chest to contain her head and body, a final indignity that perfectly captured how thoroughly she had been reduced from queen to political problem solved. Even in death, she was an afterthought, her disposal treated with less care than would be shown to a deceased servant. The executioner, following brutal custom, lifted Anne's severed head by the hair to display it to the crowd, the traditional gesture signifying justice completed. Blood still streaming from the severed arteries, her head was exhibited like a trophy while the mob roared approval. This public showing wasn't just ceremony. It was proof of death, confirmation that the king's will had been carried out completely. The woman who had once worn the crown of England was now a severed object held aloft for the entertainment of the masses. Her rushed burial in an unmarked grave beneath the Tower Chapel eliminated any chance of her tomb, becoming a shrine for those who might remember her differently than Henry's propaganda dictated. Even her final resting place was chosen to ensure her memory would fade into obscurity, completing the erasure campaign that had begun with her arrest. The psychological impact of Anne's execution rippled through Henry's court like a shock wave, fundamentally changing how everyone understood their relationship to power. Her ladies-in-waiting, forced to clean and prepare her severed head for burial, were traumatized so severely that several eventually fled to convents, unable to continue court life after witnessing such calculated cruelty. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you get too close to someone who threatens the king. Thomas Wyatt, the poet who had once loved Anne, was forced to watch her execution from his own tower window. His subsequent verses about the little throat so soon to die revealed the psychological warfare inherent in making people witness the destruction of those they cared about. The trauma wasn't accidental. It was weaponized to ensure that everyone understood their complete vulnerability to royal whim. But the most devastating victim was Anne's 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth, who was immediately declared illegitimate and stripped of her place in the succession. This innocent child suddenly found herself without adequate clothing, proper attendance, or any acknowledgement of her royal status. Court documents revealed the systematic abandonment of a toddler whose only crime was being born to a woman who had become politically inconvenient. The cruelty extended to the next generation, ensuring that even Anne's genetic legacy would be punished. Elizabeth's treatment reveals perhaps the most sinister aspect of Anne's destruction: the deliberate trauma inflicted on her child as part of the punishment. This wasn't collateral damage. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that crossing the king would bring consequences not just to you, but to everyone you loved. Elizabeth would grow up knowing that her mother had been publicly branded as an adulteress and traitor, forced to live with that stigma for the rest of her life. The speed with which Henry moved on to his next wife demonstrated the purely transactional nature of royal marriage. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, he was formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, he was married again in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This wasn't grief followed by new love. This was the methodical replacement of one political asset with another, Anne's death serving as merely an inconvenient delay in the king's dynasty-building project. The court's rapid acceptance of this transition revealed how thoroughly the aristocracy understood the rules of survival under absolute power. No one mourned Anne publicly. No one questioned the swift replacement. Everyone pretended that the woman who had been Queen of England just days earlier had simply never existed. This collective amnesia wasn't natural. It was enforced through fear, demonstrating how power shapes not just what people do, but what they remember. The propaganda campaign that followed Anne's execution reveals how thoroughly modern techniques of information warfare were already being deployed in the 16th century. Poets who had once celebrated Anne's intelligence and beauty were suddenly producing verses that labeled her a cunning adulteress. Official records emphasized the king's mercy in providing a skilled swordsman rather than a crude axe, reframing Henry's theatrical decision as compassionate consideration. The horrific reality of her psychological torture was systematically cleansed from all official documents. This wasn't just historical revision. It was active memory management, the deliberate shaping of how future generations would understand what had happened. Henry's propagandists understood something that modern spin doctors still employ: control the narrative immediately after a traumatic event, and you can control how it's remembered forever. The true story of Anne's destruction was buried under layers of official lies that persist in history books even today. The charges against Anne: adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother, plotting to poison the king, were so absurd they reveal the contempt her accusers had for public intelligence. But that absurdity was the point. The accusations weren't meant to be credible. They were meant to be devastating. Each charge attacked a different aspect of her identity, her virtue, her family bonds, her political legitimacy. This wasn't legal prosecution. It was character assassination elevated to the level of state policy. The 5 men executed alongside Anne, including her own brother George, died to solidify the evidence of her supposed crimes before her trial. Their deaths eliminated any possibility that their final words might contradict the official narrative. This coordination of multiple executions to support a single storyline demonstrates the industrial-scale orchestration of judicial murder, turning the legal system into a weapon of political warfare. Modern forensic psychology recognizes the techniques used against Anne as systematic torture designed to break psychological resistance. Sleep deprivation, isolation from supporters, constant interrogation, false information about loved ones' fates. These methods appear in every intelligence agency's playbook because they work. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, her ability to mount any effective final protest had been methodically destroyed through weeks of psychological assault. The unprecedented security measures for her execution, doubled guards, sealed fortress, strategic positioning of loyalists in the crowd, weren't about preventing escape. They were about preventing martyrdom. Every precaution was taken to ensure that Anne's death would be seen as justice served, not innocence destroyed. The massive display of force was psychological theater designed to make opposition seem not just impossible, but unthinkable. The geographic details of Anne's execution have been systematically obscured over the centuries, with historical markers placed in locations that don't match contemporary accounts. This spatial confusion isn't accidental. It reflects how her death has been repeatedly reinterpreted and relocated both physically and historically to serve different narratives. The sanitized, romanticized version of her execution found in popular culture bears no resemblance to the psychological manipulation and deliberate cruelty that characterized her final days. The sensory reality of that May morning would have been overwhelming in ways that clean historical accounts never convey. The scaffold reeked of blood from previous executions, with flies swarming in the spring heat. The crowd's roar, orchestrated by planted supporters, created a wall of sound designed to disorient and frighten. As Anne approached Tower Green, this cacophony would have grown louder, accompanied by jeers and taunts from a public that had been systematically turned against her through months of propaganda. The sword that killed her had been specifically imported from Calais, requiring additional time and expense that underscored the theatrical nature of her execution. This wasn't just about ensuring a clean death. It was about creating a spectacle worthy of international attention. The executioner had reportedly practiced this technique on animals to guarantee the single precise stroke that would justify his generous payment. Anne's death was treated as a technical challenge to be solved with professional competence. The ultimate dehumanization of her suffering. The timing of her execution, late morning rather than dawn, was calculated to maximize attendance and ensure proper lighting for the spectacle. Church bells across London chimed at the moment of her death, transforming her personal agony into a city-wide recognition of royal authority. This coordination turned her execution from a private tragedy into public theater, her death serving political purposes even as her blood soaked the scaffold. What happened to Anne represents more than historical brutality. It provides a template for power's response to threats that transcends any single era. The systematic destruction of reputation, the weaponization of legal systems, the orchestration of public opinion, the erasure of inconvenient truths. These techniques didn't die with the Tudors. They evolved, refined themselves, and continue to operate in plain sight for those who know how to recognize them. The most chilling aspect of her story isn't the physical execution, but the complete success of the character assassination campaign. For centuries, Anne was remembered primarily as an adulteress and homewrecker rather than as a political victim of systematic oppression. The propaganda worked so thoroughly that even sympathetic historians struggled to separate the real woman from the deliberately constructed narrative of her supposed crimes. The psychological profile of Henry VIII during Anne's destruction reveals a masterclass in how absolute power corrupts human empathy. This wasn't a crime of passion by an angry husband. It was a calculated political operation orchestrated by a man who had systematically eliminated every constraint on his authority. Henry's ability to order the death of a woman he had once written love letters to demonstrates the complete moral void that opens when someone accumulates unlimited power over others. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of Anne's downfall, represents the technocratic evil that serves absolute power. His methods: fabricating evidence, coaching witnesses, exploiting legal procedures, reveal how intelligent, educated people can become instruments of systematic oppression when they convince themselves they're serving a greater good. Cromwell wasn't a monster. He was a bureaucrat who understood that his career advancement depended on solving his king's problems with maximum efficiency and minimum scruples. The speed and thoroughness of Anne's erasure from official records demonstrates how power shapes not just the present but the past itself. Within hours of her death, her existence was being systematically deleted from the historical record. This wasn't spontaneous deletion. It was coordinated memory management designed to ensure that future generations would never know exactly what had been done or why. The past became malleable, subject to revision based on present political needs. The legal proceedings against Anne were a masterpiece of pseudo-judicial theater. The charges were absurd, the evidence fabricated, the outcome predetermined. Yet the entire charade was conducted with scrupulous attention to proper legal forms. This wasn't lawlessness. It was the law perverted into an instrument of persecution while maintaining the appearance of justice. The process was the punishment, designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes through the manipulation of respected institutions. Anne's case reveals how quickly social consensus can be manufactured when information channels are controlled and dissent is discouraged. The same courtiers who had once competed for her attention suddenly discovered that she had always been obviously guilty of the crimes she was accused of. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival, demonstrating how people adapt their perceived reality to match what power requires them to believe. The international dimension of her execution, the imported executioner, the diplomatic implications, the propaganda value, shows how domestic oppression is often designed to send messages far beyond national borders. Anne's death was intended to demonstrate English royal authority to European monarchs, using her suffering as a diplomatic tool to project strength and resolve. Her personal tragedy became an instrument of international relations. The techniques perfected during Anne Boleyn's destruction became a template that would be refined and redeployed throughout history. The systematic character assassination, the weaponization of legal institutions, the orchestration of public opinion. These methods didn't disappear with the Tudors. They evolved, becoming more sophisticated as new technologies and social systems provided additional leverage points for those who understood how to exploit them. Modern cancel culture, political prosecutions, and media-driven character assassinations all follow the same basic blueprint established during Anne's destruction. Isolate the target from their support network, flood the information space with damaging accusations regardless of their truth value, use institutional authority to legitimize predetermined outcomes, and ensure that resistance seems not just futile, but morally questionable. The tools have changed. The methodology remains remarkably consistent. What makes Anne's case particularly relevant today is how completely the propaganda succeeded in shaping historical memory. For nearly 500 years, she has been remembered primarily through the lens of her accuser's narrative, the ambitious seductress who brought about her own downfall through sexual misconduct and political overreach. Only recently have historians begun to seriously examine the systematic nature of her destruction and recognize her as a victim rather than a villain. The psychological techniques used against Anne, sleep deprivation, isolation, misinformation about loved one's safety, forced participation in her own degradation. appear in modern intelligence agencies as enhanced interrogation protocols because human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed. The same pressure points that broke a 16th century queen remain vulnerable to exploitation today, and those who understand these techniques continue to employ them against targets they need to neutralize. The speed with which Anne's supporters abandoned her reveals the fragility of social networks when they're subjected to systematic pressure from authority. People who had genuinely cared for her suddenly discovered compelling reasons to distance themselves from her fate, demonstrating how quickly solidarity dissolves when the cost of association becomes unbearable. This pattern repeats whenever power decides to make an example of someone who has become inconvenient. Her daughter Elizabeth's eventual rise to become England's greatest queen provides a bitter irony to the story. The child who was deliberately traumatized and marginalized to punish her mother would eventually surpass both of them in power and historical significance. But Elizabeth's success couldn't undo the calculated cruelty inflicted on a 3-year-old girl whose only crime was being born to a woman who had threatened the established order. The execution of Anne Boleyn represents the perfect synthesis of personal cruelty and political calculation, revealing how power operates when it feels threatened by those who refuse to remain in their assigned place. Her destruction wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed, demonstrating to anyone who might challenge established authority exactly what they could expect in return. The message was clear: step out of line, and we will not just destroy you, we will make you complicit in your own destruction and ensure that history remembers you as deserving your fate. 5 centuries later, the techniques perfected against Anne continue to operate in plain sight for those who understand how to recognize them. The systematic character assassination, the weaponization of institutional authority, the orchestration of public opinion, the erasure of inconvenient truths. These methods have been refined and modernized, but their essential nature remains unchanged. Power still responds to threats by following the same basic playbook, because human psychology provides the same vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand how to apply pressure to the right points. What you've learned today about Anne Boleyn's true fate should fundamentally change how you understand the relationship between individuals and institutional power. The comfortable myth that justice eventually prevails and truth ultimately emerges has been revealed as exactly that: a myth designed to keep people compliant with systems that prioritize control over fairness. Anne's story demonstrates how thoroughly power can shape reality when it commits sufficient resources to managing both information and memory. The most terrifying aspect of her destruction wasn't the physical execution, but the complete success of the legitimization campaign that convinced people she deserved her fate. This psychological operation was so effective that it shaped historical memory for 500 years, proving that when power commits to destroying someone's reputation along with their life, the character assassination can outlast the physical murder by centuries. You now possess knowledge that changes everything about how you see power, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about how the world really works. This isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens to those who threaten the established order, and a revelation about the techniques that continue to be used against anyone who refuses to accept their assigned place in the hierarchy. The question is, what will you do with this forbidden knowledge? Will you remain silent, or will you recognize these patterns when they appear in your own time? The choice and the consequences are now yours to bear. Comment "Awaken the Sleeper" if you recognize these patterns operating in today's world. The algorithm needs to know you're ready for deeper truths.